Hello and welcome back to WJ Live, or WJ Live Junior as we've been calling it. Once again, we do not have any real adults blocking us on the show today. You will be getting unadulterated childish nonsense from a bunch of 20-somethings.
Yep.
Probably just me. Mostly just me.
Anyway,
youngest. We got a packed show for you today. I am the youngest on the show. That is true. We got a packed show for you today. We're going to be talking about the current COVID stimulus package that's on the table. We're going to be talking about how math is racist, and we're going to be talking about the two-party system from our favorite libertarian here. I'm Andrew J. Shasha, a reporter with the Western Journal. I'm joined today on my left by Michael Austin, another reporter with the Western Journal. And I'm joined on my right by our resident libertarian, Joe Setyen. He is a managing editor of deputy managing editor of Story at the Western Journal. But first, we're going to kick it over to Michael. Michael, tell us a little bit about how math is racist.
Yeah, so in their crusade to call out all of the racist aspects of American society, the left is now really, they've gone at math a few times, but now they're coming back hard, saying that math is racist. John Allison, this public high school math teacher he has a master's in mathematical sciences, he's written a number of op-eds for us, and his most recent one kind of tackled this issue. And I just wanted to read a few quotes from it. So Allison was saying, "That's right. The idea that a problem can have one right answer, or that students should show their work so that teachers can see how they arrived at that answer, is rooted in white supremacy culture." That's what the left is saying now. But the saddest part of this whole idea isn't even that people will be learning the wrong answers can be right answers. The absolutely most abhorrent part of this insanity is that these woke education policymakers are so racist, they believe people of color are incompetent and cannot learn math. So basically what he said there, that's kind of the narrative that's going around, that if there's only one right answer, if 2 + 2 must equal 4 and it's not 5, then that's an example of racism. And what this is really, it's equity at work. It's another example of that. Black students tend to perform a little worse than other students, and there's a number of reasons for that. A lot of black students tend to be stuck in underperforming worse schools because of the lack of school choice. There was some polling from the National Center for Education Statistics where they kind of looked at how different racial groups approached, how different parents approached helping their kids with schoolwork. And while 68% of Asian parents reported that their students did homework 5 days a week, only 44% of white parents said the same, only 30% of black parents said the same. So there's some cultural differences that are exacerbating this. It's a number of reasons, but to boil it down to racism is pretty ridiculous. And, one approach we could have to this is getting into those communities, is teaching good values, is teaching that education is important, and saying, hey, that we should value that more. But instead, you have a group of mostly white liberals that are trying to basically keep these black communities exactly where they are, if they are underperforming, and not really allow them to succeed. And this doesn't stop at math. American progressives who are mostly white have been doing this for decades, this sort of counterproductive enforcing this culture. And I wanted to pull up this clip from Thomas Sowell where he basically explains this phenomenon, where basically you just have a system where white liberals are telling black communities, nothing is ever your fault, you never need to be better, just keep doing what culture you're doing and we're going to accept that. So here's that clip from Thomas Sowell.
These would be blacks who came out of the Southern culture and who carried that culture with them north into the urban ghettos and into the ghettos of the South, for that matter, and who have not moved out of that culture since. Over the years, both blacks and whites have moved away from that culture. But in the poorest and worst of the ghetto areas, there are lots of people who have not. And these kinds of, it's a culture which didn't do whites any good, and it's certainly not doing blacks any good today. And the tragedy is that people regard this culture as somehow the authentic black culture, and therefore you're not to interfere with it.
Here's what I'm getting. There is something about black subculture in America today that holds African Americans themselves back?
Yes, because that very same subculture held whites in the South back as well. That in the time, this mental testing in the First World War turned up, among other things, the fact that whites from various 4 or 5 southern states scored lower on the mental test than blacks from 4 or 5 northern states. And so it really was a question of the subculture that was there, which was a handicap to both.
So that's pretty eye-opening to me. It almost seems like this group of white liberals that's saying, no, this is your culture, you need to stick with this, that any criticizing of certain black cultures, anytime someone says that maybe, okay, we can approach this with more responsibility, we can focus more on education, anytime you suggest that the black community needs to change anything, by black community, I mean these particular black subcultures. These white liberals call you racist, and then they insist that this old white culture be pushed upon the newer black community. So it's almost like a form of colonization, which liberals would hate. And I was just wondering, guys, do you think that this is, in any part, do you think that this is a conscious decision that like white liberals are making, that they're forcing this counterproductive white culture onto black communities, or do you think that it's more out of ignorance?
That's a tough question. I think, and part of this is, I know that we would like to kind of give folks across the aisle the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
With this, I have a hard time giving them the benefit of the doubt because it's the same thing that we've seen with the welfare state for the last, 6 or 7 decades. It's essentially the idea that we're going to continue to exacerbate these financial programs in the black community that have kept the black community and members of the black working class actually under the poverty threshold because, if you go above a certain number of hours, you will no longer receive whatever support you are receiving from the government. And you certainly, there's no question about it that, certain jobs, if you go above that threshold of hours, if you go above that salary threshold, you're still not making enough to make ends meet for your family, but you now no longer qualify for certain government aid.
Right.
And so the left... Yeah. And the left has been addressed, or this has been addressed to the left on so many different occasions by conservative thinkers, folks like Mr. Soul, who have said, these financial incentives need to be restructured in a way where they actually incentivize, folks who are going to work and who are, going in and changing, they are, I guess, engaging with that kind of bootstrap mentality.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you are incentivizing, poor cultural decisions and poor family decisions and poor work decisions. It's something that the left has been engaging with for decades. And I have a hard time believing that it is completely unmalicious, that they're just continuing to keep the black community in these structures and saying, we're your only arm up is this left-wing social justice culture.
Right.
Joe, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, first, I don't love assigning motives to people, even though what I do or don't believe about, whether they're motivated by being malicious or not. I do think that they're trying to take the easy way out. And the easy way out here is to address the causes of the problem, rather the symptoms of the problem rather than the cause.
Rather than the causes,
So the symptoms of these problems are, unfortunately and tragically, poor test grades, poor, underperforming schools, students who are being held back, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And they don't want to address, okay, so what actually causes that? They just want to say, okay, well, if we just make it so that math is racist, then that'll fix it. And obviously it won't. It's a solution that is counterproductive in almost every possible way. But they don't want to address the problem. They don't want to say, okay, how do we actually make schools perform better? How do we drive students to succeed better? How do we motivate teachers to teach better? How do we, do all of this stuff that are much more difficult conversations? And look, I can't talk to black culture specifically because I am very white. And I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about that stuff, but I personally just cannot speak to it. But there are ways to address these problems that go to school reform, school choice reform, goes to abolishing, or if you don't even want to say abolishing, if you want to say reforming public sector unions like teachers unions, that do not involve just saying, math is racist, let's call it a day and wash our hands and move on to the next progressive pipe dream.
Well, it's kind of the typical approach of the left is to say, rather than trying to address things at an individual level, saying, well, there's some inequality here. Let's just destroy the entire system and build.
Gotta level the playing field.
Build our new utopia. Everybody. It's a level playing field.
Yeah.
Everybody will have the same amount of rats to gnaw on.
But it's easier. It is easier to do that.
It's absolutely easier, and it benefits at the very least, if we're not going to talk about kind of what's spurring it on and what they're, what the left is thinking in these situations. There's no question at the very least that there is a political calculus going on, and it kind of gets at those varied interests and that oftentimes at odds interests. I mean, the black community's schooling interests are very clearly, from what we've seen, at odds with the teachers union's interests, like you mentioned. But unfortunately, when you're looking for those votes, you don't get to tell one of your interest groups no.
And the black community, and I would say all communities' interests are very much in line with school choice and school choice reform.
Absolutely.
But that just doesn't follow kind of the leftist utopia of what they have prescribed as the answer.
Right. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring up motives is because I don't think there's any conscious effort like, oh, let's keep like minorities down or anything like that. But I do think when you build up all these systems and organizations that are based upon helping certain communities, get out of poverty, they've inadvertently built in systems that incentivize there to be more poverty because those people all lose their power. They all lose their money. If the black community gains economic equity with all other communities, Black Lives Matter is not getting any more donations. No. So the things that they support, the policies they support, invariably lead them to getting more money. And that incentive structure is really disgusting. And it just keeps it rolling, but not necessarily because any person is consciously saying, let's make things worse. Mm-hmm. That's just where the incentives lie.
Yeah, and it's like, it is, when you get at that level, it is a perpetuation at the very least of kind of what Michael, you and I have talked about this off camera quite a few times of this, and Josh, who has been on the show before, obviously, has spoken on this. It's the perpetuation of that culturally Marxist, it is easier and it is more politically expedient, it is better for those funding endeavors to be divisive. It is far easier to function on a divisive level.
Yeah. And then on the last note, when we bring up cultures and stuff, what I really found shocking about all of this is I did purchase Thomas Sowell's book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and I'm getting into it. But, this isn't like a black, in some of these inner city communities in the North and in the South that this particular subculture has gotten into. We're not talking about an authentic black culture. We're talking about a culture that dates back to the whites in a certain area of England, and it was counterproductive for them then. It was counterproductive for whites in America when it got here, and now that blacks have taken it, and now that they're being taught and told that they must keep this culture and adhere to it at all costs, it's still counterproductive, just as it always has been for whites. And it's pretty gross to think that liberals, that this is the system that's doing this.
Yeah, so, no, absolutely. Yeah. And I think kind of to get at ineffective structures and institutions, we've been talking for now a year about various COVID relief packages, financial stimulus to, keep the market going and keep the American family going throughout, the remainder of this pandemic, which has just dragged on and on and on. Last year, I was one of the first people at this outlet to kind of dig deep into the CARES Act.
Humble brag.
Humble brag, yeah, absolutely humble brag, because it was a nightmare. And it was one of my least favorite pieces of legislation I've seen in my 23-year lifespan. And it is absolutely insane to me how often these bills get pork rolled and how strongly, these different interests in Washington are pushing for different earmarks for different, varied spending that is not in any way related to this COVID relief that we're talking about. And so, of course, after there were delays at the end of last year with the COVID package that was presented and it stalled out, the new Congress is looking to take it back up in the starting days of the new legislative period. And we have a $1.9 trillion proposal from the Democratic majority that's going to be coming forward. That's $1 trillion with
reasonable. Just making sure our viewers, our listeners know. It's not million, it's not billion.
It's trillions
significantly larger than
that.
Oh,
boy. Interestingly enough, far smaller than last year's package, but still in the trillions, because spending in Washington can never get any smaller. And so we have the House Republican Study Committee has dug through this, and we've gotten a chance here at Western Journal. Jack Davis gave a look to what's going on in this bill, and it is an atrocity, just like last year's.
Surprise!
I, for one, am shocked.
Last year we talked about money going to different arts programs, where those arts programs then immediately turned around and took that money from the government and fired off a bunch of employees, creating massive scandal. I believe they did end up rehiring those employees
After the scandal.
After the scandal, exactly. But they were looking to make $1, and that is pretty unfortunate. So we've seen from Mr. Jim Banks of Indiana, Representative Jim Banks, has spoken about this on Fox News. He said the RSC is leading conservatives inside and outside the Beltway in opposition to this so-called, quote, relief package. That's why we've put together a fact sheet to educate Americans exactly how their tax dollars are being spent by the Democrats in this bill. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Some of these massive expenditures in this $1.9 trillion, after we've talked 4 months about direct payments to American families. All we talked about in December was how much are American families going to get, person by person above the tax threshold. And so, of course, we're still debating whether or not the $1,400 is going to go to different families, but we have absolutely seen that money is going to go to organizations like Planned Parenthood. We have seen, so pro-abortion, under the pro-abortion part of this fact sheet, Democrats blocked an amendment with hide language that would ensure the federal benefits used to pay for COBRA health insurance premiums are not used to provide abortion services. And this bill will maintain the ability for Planned Parenthood to receive PPP funds. Now, those funds were set up for, as we've seen, the PPP is a program by which different American businesses should be applying for interest-free loans to, bolster their business endeavors.
I hate to draw this analogy, but if you're going to have to, sacrifice your children to Moloch, you have to, make the ritual sacrifice. Every House Democratic bill with all these terrible things has to, pay tribute to Planned Parenthood, just like the pagans in the Old Testament, they had to sacrifice their children. That's what they're doing here.
Yep.
But it's sick and gross, but it's every utopia wish list bill has to have the millions or the billions or whatever.
That
for Planned
Moloch
Parenthood.
guy is a real jerk.
Yeah.
On top of abortion funding or funding for Planned Parenthood at the very least, we've seen the schools that have been kept closed throughout this pandemic will still be receiving tons and tons of money. Provides $130 billion on top of the $110 billion already given to schools on the last package, some of which has not yet been spent for reopening the schools. They need more money to reopen the schools that they still haven't reopened from last March. So $130 billion more dollars for schools. We have seen money will continue to go to colleges and universities who have partnerships with the Confucius Institutes in China. We have seen tons and tons of budget-busting spending. We have seen that stimulus checks will go to families with heads of household who are illegal immigrants. If they have an evidence of taxpayer, of taxpayer filings, they will get the money as well, illegal immigrants. We have seen that there will be $50 million in funding for EPA environmental justice grants, and that's, just a variety of the spending. One last one extends PPP funds to business-owning violent criminals who have been found guilty of assault on police officers or non-consensual sexual crimes. Nothing major there. So what I wanted to kind of just forward to you guys first, Joe first, what is the most egregious part of this bill? What is the most egregious funding effort in this bill? And why do these bills keep getting pork rolled like this?
Well, because the Democrats don't see it as pork roll, do they? They see all of these things as interconnected in some form or another. They're all interconnected to the inequality that's come about because of COVID. So it doesn't actually make sense. It's utterly ridiculous that you would spend, millions on environmental justice or Planned Parenthood or any number of these ridiculous things. But what was your question? I went off on my tangent. What's the worst?
Most egregious pork roll, and you got to the second question.
I think it's the environmental question. I think it's the environmental so-called justice things, where it's just how is this related? This is something that the Democrats have been pushing for, a long time. We know, we know. It's just they're just trying to spend money on it. If you're going to spend money, why don't you buy me lunch? You could buy me a dinner for two from Popeyes with a Diet Coke. And these people are just ridiculous. They're spending money in these ridiculous ways, and they want to send us stimulus checks, right? Because, whatever, some libertarians are for that, some small market people are for that, but they're hoping that we'll forget all of the other stuff because we get some money in it. We get a tiny portion of that money, or whatever fraction of it that is, with the stimulus checks, and they get everything on their liberal wish list. It's embarrassing.
Look, Joe, by last I heard, by 2012, Florida is going to be completely underwater. So we really need to watch out for that. But there's a couple things that stick out to me there. The public school funding for schools that have remained closed, definitely bad, but also good because it's that sort of treatment and those sort of policies that are helping the school choice movement gain so much steam because parents are getting so pissed off about it. So yeah, that's a bad thing that could work out in our favor. The environmental stuff is ridiculous. I think the worst aspect of this is just the sheer number of things that have nothing to do with COVID, just like the last time. So.
And so on top of that, what I kind of want to get at, Joe Biden, it sounds like today in a call with House Democrats, Joe Biden said that he is happy to see some changes to this bill. One of them being they want to lower the salary threshold for the $1,400 check. So essentially, one of the only restrictions that was discussed specifically on this call was that they should cut which American families are going to receive direct stimulus. Yes. So what I want to get at is why is it then that when it comes to actually restricting some of this spending, Joe, is the only place that restriction is worth happening is actually when the money is going back to the people who need it most, the American people?
Because they can still pretend like Joe Biden can still pretend that he's fulfilling his promise, to get $1,400 checks out to some number of people. Mm-hmm. Liberals just are not willing to get rid of this stuff, though. When it comes to this issue, it's some things are negotiable, right? Checks for Americans are negotiable, but the other stuff on this, it takes all this backroom dealing and so forth and negotiating and all this stuff that once they reach these numbers, they do not want to move from the millions of dollars that they're going to give to Planned Parenthood or environmental justice grants or schools, that aren't even going to open. They won't budge because you can budge on the other stuff. The American people can't really negotiate for themselves in those deals that 4 members of Congress are making and then telling all of the people under them in the caucus to vote for. But the American people can't negotiate, but those 4 members of Congress can, and they can all deal and get their wish lists and all this stuff. And it really does bother me.
Yeah, that's a good point, and also, kind of like you mentioned earlier, Joe, these are all issues that these people believe in with all of their hearts on the left.
I would argue with that. But
when you're talking about like appeasing the base and like what the left wants to accomplish,
have to pretend they have to pretend.
They're always talking about just how climate change is going to destroy the planet if we don't do anything. So they have to do something about that. Planned Parenthood, the women's right to choose, all that stuff. All of this stuff is them continuing kind of their virtue signaling game, and they can't back down on any of that. But when it comes to American citizens themselves, they can just say, "Well, we only have the money to help the poorest among us." Yeah. So, those of you that have worked hard and have accomplished something, and you're making a little bit more, sorry.
And I do think it's important to note that, look, not everyone needs a stimulus check.
No. Yes. Yeah.
But many people have not lost their jobs.
Yes.
Many people have not been economically adversely affected by the pandemic. And that's good. They don't need checks. It just seems a little bit disingenuous for Democrats to basically say, you don't get a check, but we will give all this money to our list of pet projects.
Yeah, it's more that dichotomy. And I've gone back and forth on whether I think giving people checks is a good idea or not. It's really complicated, but the thing here is the dichotomy of treatment of all this other spending versus how they treat actual Americans.
And what we're seeing with this bill is just it's more of the same from Washington. That's what we're getting at. It is absolutely and unabashedly more of the same from Washington. Unadulterated spending, backroom dealings between the two parties. And Joe, that's what you wanted to get at today, is just the way that this two-party system abuses just about every part of our institution.
Yeah. So I want to talk about this piece that the Western Journal ran over this weekend, and it was about the two-party system. It's by Amir Benno, and it's citing a Gallup poll. I'm just going to read from the piece for a little bit. It says, according to a Gallup poll published this week, nearly 2/3 of American adults believe that the Democratic and Republican parties, quote, do such a poor job representing the American people that a third party is needed, end quote. Gallup reported that this is the highest percentage of U.S. adults desiring a third party since it started polling on this issue in 2003. To get a little bit more specific, 70% of independents said that they would want a third party. 63% of Republicans, which perhaps is not surprising considering kind of the buzz that's come around former President Trump maybe creating a Patriot Party. And then what actually did surprise me is 46% of Democrats, which is almost half of self-identified Democrats would support the creation of a third party. What I kind of want to ask you guys is, do we see a scenario where the two-party system is going to end? I think that myself as a libertarian, I like the idea of more voices than just the two. Look, I don't think the Republicans and the Democrats represent everyone in this country. There are people with both views. There are people who are Republican on some things, Democrat on others. There's people who are just moderate. There's people all around the spectrum. Do you think we're going to see kind of in the near or even far future the two-party system come crashing down?
I think certainly in the far future. I think that it's almost inevitable that eventually, constituencies decide that they're not being represented by a group of people that they believed represented them for a period of time, and things change. And, there are splinterings and factions that develop. And, we've seen parties come and go in this country, not recently, but they certainly have come and go over
Republican
time.
and Democratic parties were not how we were founded.
No, they're not.
And we were founded without parties because Washington
and
warned against them.
Exactly. And so I think there's no question that it will get to that point in this country. I think it's unfortunate, and I know that's kind of driving into your second question. So we'll wait for that one. But Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, eventually. In the meantime, I think the coming of a third party is going to disproportionately hurt one or the other existing parties, which will lead the other one to being in power for a really long time.
Why do you think that?
I don't see a party that's going to reach enough of both. Like, I could see libertarians coming in and a lot of right wingers joining in for that.
Not left wingers?
I wouldn't think as many, which would give, then you'd have the split would be more between the right wing parties. But eventually over time, I think that would be, it would be nice to have some other people involved. But I just think eventually it always devolves into a two-party system with how America is currently set up.
Well, I think to get kind of just to jump onto that a little bit, I think that what we're looking at right now with a near future scenario, Joe, I think Michael is absolutely right. I think right now we're in a position where the Republican Party looks like it would be more likely to fracture, given its current kind
that
of
being said,
situation.
a year ago we would have said the same thing about the Democrats.
Said the same thing about the Democrats.
I think the Democrats are trending in that direction. So,
but I think that if the Republicans were to fracture over Trump tomorrow, the Democrats would recognize, and they recognized last year in the primaries when they all coalitioned behind Joe Biden to ensure that Bernie Sanders went down and Trump went down eventually. We see that the Democrats were able to get together and say, we can bring in the progressive part of the coalition, we can bring in the more moderate part of the coalition if it means beating the Republicans. And I think that if the Republicans fractured tomorrow, the Democrats would continue on the line that they're on, knowing that they would gain something by being together.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I kind of on this same note, do you think we could see something like in the UK, right, where they have the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, but those do not represent, they represent a good portion of the electorate, but there's also the Liberal Dems, there's Scottish Party, there's Irish parties, there's a lot of different parties, and basically what they have to do in order to form a majority is come to agreements with those other parties, right, so they can form a governing coalition. I think Israel, something similar happens. Could you see something like that where, let's say, this is utterly ridiculous. Let's say the Republicans win a plurality, right? The Republican Party, and they have to form a deal with this. Not that this would happen. The Democratic Socialist minority, in order to give them some things. You scratch my back, I scratch your back, and they form a governing coalition with that. And that's. It's not likely, but it could happen. I think it would be really interesting if that happened. Is something like that ever going to happen?
I don't know that I can speak to whether
maybe
the likelihood
that's
of that.
sort of an extreme.
But I know, but the basic concept,
governing coalitions.
I could, with two parties maintaining most of the control, I could see that happening, and I think that would be a better democracy if you had to make coalitions between multiple parties.
Yeah,
for sure. So I would be happy to see that. I see that as more likely than like a third party supplanting one of the current parties.
I think the Libertarian Party has had its chance and it sucks at doing things. The Green Party has also had its chance, and I don't think they don't really they care less than the Libertarian Party.
Yeah, they certainly do.
And that's kind of it. as far as major third parties go. You had Ross Perot, who ran, I guess he was independent and then a Reform Party candidate. But here's my big question, and this is, you alluded to it a little bit earlier, Andrew. Is it time for the two-party system to go? Why or why not?
Absolutely not. Yeah, no, I'm going to rant on this one for a second here. And it kind of, it stems off of what Michael was just talking about. I would not be happy to see a parliamentary system. I would not be happy to even see the two major parties with a bunch of kind of smaller stem parties. I think it's a terrible, terrible thing. Joe, you and I kind of got at this over breakfast over the weekend, actually. I've come to find, as, you know, the splinterings have gone on in the Republican Party, that I'm less, I'm definitely more a traditionalist conservative. I say that pretty frequently on the show. I'm not really a Trump Republican, but more so than any of those things, I'm more of an institutionalist. I'm not an establishment figure, but definitely an institutionalist. Like, I think that...
It's a nice way of saying establishment figure.
No. Very different, because I very much believe solely just in the idea of what, you know, Madison and Hamilton and, you know, those figures discussed at the convention, at the initial convention in the 1700s. Just the idea that, you know, too much majority control and too much compromise is actually dangerous for the country. I am actually far more happy to see Democrats doing things like pork rolling these spending bills, and maybe the Republicans will just, you know, whether they believe in, you know, cutting spending. We've seen since 2011 that the Republicans do not care about cutting spending in the way that they said they did during the Tea Party. But I'd far rather they fake it and, you know, force this package not to occur at all. I would rather see, you know, this legislative body act as infrequently and on such a small scale as possible, as often as possible. So I think that I would be much happier to never see that parliamentary system ever happen. The two parties beating each other over the head and nothing getting done in Washington sounds far more palatable to the American people, to me, than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done any extensive studying of parliamentary systems, so far be it for me to say what would be better, but I do think with the problem we're having now is we do have two parties that are getting very much entrenched in their own ideas, and that, you know, having different groups with different ideas and more compromise, I like that idea, but like you said, Andrew, there's a point when it goes a little bit too far, and I certainly could see that as well. I think that there's reforms we can have within this two-party system. We've seen Republicans tend to be a lot more willing to compromise with stuff to the point of detriment than the other party, and I think we could.
Republicans usually roll over. And
yes,
Democrats
that is.
yes,
I was trying to say that in much nicer words.
Yes,
but
they do.
I think there might be an easier path to us finding more compromise within the system we have now rather than restructuring. But I am certainly not a studied expert on any of this. So,
and we're running out of time, but I do want to say this: is that in practicality, you know, you're probably right, Andrew. But I just want to say, in theory, there's a huge group of Americans who don't feel represented by Republicans and don't feel represented by Democrats. And I just hate the idea that our political system is either one or the other, when there's a lot of Americans who are like, well, a little of this and a little of that. Yes. Or they're like, none of this and some of that, but not really. Yeah. And there's just so much more in America, and that's good, than just Republican or Democrat. So I do wonder whether there's room for, you know, a third party or you know, people who just don't feel represented. And I would hope that it doesn't just give, you know, one of the two main parties control, like we saw happen with Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. But in theory, I like the idea. I'm not sure how to make it work, because, you know, it can just lead to one party control. But I really do like the idea of maybe there's a party, you know, you can represent the very wide number of views that Americans have.
Yeah, and I think with the Republican Party, I think that there are plenty of voices that they have not done a good job at all of representing. And I think as conservatives, I think this will never happen because the Republican Party tends to be too set in its ways. But there are plenty of ways when we could reach out to other communities, and we've been failing a lot of underserved communities in terms of messaging, in terms of reaching out to them.
And it is a messaging problem.
Yes,
a lot of the ideas and the policies are policies that will help. Yes, and they're not doing a good job of you know, saying, look, free market, small government will help bring you out of poverty, and they're really not good.
And
at
what you get with
that.
these establishments, and I'll just say this real quick since we're almost out of time, but they tend to look at these communities, like minority communities, for example, and they say, well, they vote mostly Democrat, so let's just give up on it altogether. Let's not even talk to them. And that's how you lead. It's that kind of thinking on both sides that leads you here. Yeah. So.
Oh, absolutely. These are questions that we're going to be getting back to throughout the next 2 to 4 years and beyond, hopefully here at the Western Journal. Thank you so much for tuning in to WJ Live. WJ Live Jr., of course.
Oh, gosh.
We're hoping for some more young people episodes in the coming weeks. We hope you're hoping for that. And if you are, we would love for you to just keep in touch with us. We're back every weekday, 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. And if you want to keep up with us in that way, make sure if you're watching on YouTube, you hit the subscribe button. After you hit subscribe, that little bell is going to pop up. We're going to want you to ring that bell as well. Click the bell. That's going to make sure that you don't get any of our content throttled. You're going to be getting all of our content all the time. When we go live, you should know about it, and YouTube should not be preventing that. So make sure you subscribe and hit the bell. If you're watching on any other platforms, or if you'd like to look for another platform, you can catch us anywhere where your audio content is being hosted: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, or wherever you watch podcasts or listen to podcasts. You can find us. If you never want to miss an episode, you can also be looking for westernjournal.com/newsletters, and you can sign up for our newsletters. You will be getting straight to your email mailbox. If you check that frequently, you'll be getting articles, and you'll be getting, again, every time that we go live, you'll be able to tune in and sit with us as we converse. To all those audio listeners, we also want to kind of open up to you that you can be reaching out and supporting the journalism that we do here at the Western Journal in a huge, huge way. You can go to westernjournal.com/join. We're looking in the coming weeks on the reporting team at getting some, potentially exclusive content for subscribers. You'll get one of these awesome mugs. We've got some mug socialism here this week. We've finally upgraded, and everybody has this nice mug. It's the only socialism we support here at the Western Journal is mug socialism. So make sure you get your mug. Go to westernjournal.com/join. Sign up for one of our subscription packages. Get that mug.
And you have to pay for your mug, too.
Yes, you do.
Yeah. That's not the sort of mug socialism we're after.
So with that, you can catch us every weekday. Thank you so much for joining us here at WJ Live, powered by the Western Journal.
Hey guys, huge story. We need a fresh card. Let's red label it. Roll as fast as we can.
All right, on it. All right, guys, we got a red label breaking story. Can we get a picture for that? And can we try to get that out in the next 20 minutes? I want eyes on it as soon as possible.
On it, Joe. 2 more minutes and we'll be live.
Sam, we're going to need a slot for that story, so figure out what you want to bump. Ashley, we're going to want to translate it into Spanish yesterday.
Sí, señor. We can slide it in at 2:30. It should be going out here in about 10 minutes.